Joined by my guest, George Szamuely in Budapest. He's a podcaster at The Gaggle, which can be found on YouTube and locals. And here in Moscow, we cross to Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst and editor at InnoSme Internet Media Project. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. All right, George, reflecting upon the last 12 months is a big endeavor for a program that is short as ours. I'll start out first. I think that, the biggest thing that I've become aware of is just how anti-Russia the West is, because this has very little to do about Ukraine. You have Michael McFaul, you have Timothy Schneider, they let the mask drop. This is about the breakup of Russia, regime change, the usual playbook that we've seen over the last 30 years. And they're not even hiding it anymore. And that's going to have a very big impact on how this conflict is eventually resolved. Your thoughts?
No, that's a very interesting take. And it has been stunning, the hostility, the outright hostility in much of the Western world toward Russia, because, we'd always known about this latent hostility. We've known about this, from the time of the 19th century in Russia and so on, but it had all been subsumed by this the Cold War. That the only issue is communism. So we love the Russian people, absolutely adore Russian culture, Russian music, Russian literature, Russian painting, love it all. We just hate the communists. And all these terrible things that the communists have done, and they subjugated Eastern Europe and so on. And suddenly all of that has just dropped away. And it becomes very hard to understand what is it that you hate so much about Russia, other than that you somehow see them as the other, as they're somehow it's a culture and it's a civilization alien to yours. And it is quite remarkable the extent to which racism is perfectly sanctioned, as long as you're doing this about Russia, as long as it's Russia that is is to be condemned, is to feel absolutely alien. Whenever you pick up any media outlet, it's always something about Russian spies, Russian interference. And it's all a continual generation of hostility toward everything Russian.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like a Fukuyama end of history thing. Is once the Russians are taken out, then the world will be a better, brighter place. It's like the grand solution. Dima, you're Russian, and we're talking about your country here. What's your major takeaway? Because that was mine. Also, I think about media, how that is a very controlled message, like we've never seen before. We'll talk about that. Your thoughts, my friend.
Well, I agree with George. The view of Russia as the other is very important, but I would call it the constituent other, the other who helps you, in this case, the West, construct your own, basically, ideal identity. The syllogism is very simple. He is bad. I am not him. That means I'm good. Right? And the fact that Russians look like the Westerners, they like to say it, no, Russians are not Europeans, they look like Europeans. It makes it even more pleasant because I'm different, not in the color of my skin, not in the color of my hair. I'm different because of my values, and this is what the Lithuanian and Estonian nationalists love to repeat. They say, oh, Russians look like you, but don't get deceived, ask us. We will tell you how these people are different from you. So, of course, this is racism, and one of the most interesting elements of this tragedy that has been unfolding for the whole year, how the Western ultraliberalism adapts, kind of sifts in these elements of East European nationalism, violent nationalism. And how the ultraliberalism of the West is trying to put this ultranationalism to its service, using the hatred of Ukrainian nationalists towards Russia, using the hatred of Baltic nationalists towards Russia. But let me quote one of your recent talks with George. I love the thought of George. Great powers remain great powers precisely because they are wise enough not to fight other great powers, because that lessens your clout, and that undermines your might.
Well, and it can be existential. You can
exactly.
lose.
So, talking about the outcome of all of this, it is not clear how the whole thing will end, but it is clear that the West will get out of this weakened. The United States will be weaker than it was before the conflict.
Well, objectively, no, Dima, you're absolutely right. But George, that's not what the narrative will be. I mean, I think that you and I have talked about this before. If the conflict were to be settled right now, where the facts on the ground right now, and say it's a victory, they didn't make it to the English Channel, we won. Okay, I mean that is a reflection of just how propagandized this entire endeavor has been. There is absolutely no dissent. I mean, you can really, the cancel culture will come after you with a vengeance, George.
Yes, and that's what I was thinking about this program, is just how threadbare the NATO propaganda system is. Ever since 2008, every single NATO meeting has come to the conclusion that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. Every single one. 2008, Ukraine will be a member of NATO. And then what does our friend Sergeant Schultz say, in the last year, just before the start of Russia's so-called special military operations? Oh, nobody's seriously talking about Ukraine being a member of NATO. You said it. You said it every single year that Ukraine will be a member of NATO.
And George, and on top of that, after the 2014 Maidan coup, what did NATO do? Started turning Ukraine into a garrison state with one purpose, is to attack and quote unquote liberate the Donbass, which would weaken Russia. Okay, so but NATO has nothing to do with it. Okay,
that's exactly. I mean, and that's it. And we had this meeting again, which is still going on at the Munich Security Conference, and there is Stoltenberg once again, and as he has done many occasions, we have been in Ukraine since 2014, helping, arming, training Ukrainians. Well, then how can you go on saying it's an unprovoked attack? That's what you've been doing. You have been arming and training Ukrainians for what? For what? Well, for essentially mounting an offensive and ending the war in the Donbass. It's the one thing that this is not is unprovoked, and they keep saying this, and it's like what Russia did is unjustified. NATO has said themselves, we've had Hollande, former president of France, we had Merkel, former chancellor of Germany, we had Poroshenko, all of the people who were in Minsk 2014 and 2015, they said we never took Minsk seriously. Basically, we were just buying time, when we can mount an offensive and retake the Donbass. In other words, you were lying all these years. You were lying, and yet you have the gall to say that this was unprovoked, this was an unjustified war.
Tim, I'm glad that George brought up the Munich Security Conference. It's an annual event, and in 2007, Vladimir Putin basically put down Russia's marker and has not moved away from it since. But isn't it interesting, George, they call it a security conference, but they don't talk about security, because if they did, it would be indivisible. And that's, again, over the last 12 months, that the fact that the West does not talk seriously about security also will have an impact on how this conflict is resolved. If they had changed track, it would impact the outcome in a different way. And I'm absolutely firm on talking about security and peace. The West doesn't talk about either. As a matter of fact, they're against both. Dima.
Well, it was certainly a propaganda conference, actually. How can you talk about security when you have Zelensky addressing the start of the conference with classical music, with Schubert in the background, showing propaganda images and comparing himself to David and Russia to Goliath, and then saying that we are all Davids here, you know, Mr. Stoltenberg, you are David, you know, Angela Merkel was a David. This is all stupid, you know, it's not serious. The point about conferences is that you you try to be as objective as possible, you know, you take away emotions. We're talking about security. But this conference was all about emotions and all very short-lived, you know, provoked emotions from Mr. Zelensky. So that's absolutely true. I agree with George. How can you call it an unprovoked aggression? Just look at the events that preceded the Putin's decision and Putin's announcement on 24th of February. On the 17th of February, Donbass has to be evacuated, you know, because there are the barrage of bombardment is so thick, you know, the Ukrainian forces are massing on the border. This was a real army. I mean, look at what happened during these 12 months. They're still holding on there. They're still bombarding Donbass. This was a powerful army, which would have destroyed Donetsk and Lugansk in a matter of hours. You know, Russian army would not be able to stop it, even if Russian army moved in just 2 or 3 hours after the Ukrainians started.
Well, Dima, we have to also point out here or reaffirm that this was a NATO fortified Ukrainian military, okay, with advisors, with enormous amounts of munitions, obviously financing it, intelligence. But George, NATO is not a co-belligerent in the conflict here. See, again, if people in Munich were serious, they would talk about security. And when you talk about security, then that's the resolution. Maybe every single party involved would not be happy with the outcome ultimately, but they all could live together, and that should be the aim, George.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this really is a war that should never have happened. I mean, we have had year after year in which the Russians, Putin and Lavrov, have continually warned that we have to resolve this problem. This Minsk, you have to, apply pressure against your clients in Kiev to implement Minsk. And our patience is not endless. I mean, they've said this over and over again. And then, of course, in December, when Putin submitted those draft security treaties, that could have been the basis for negotiations. Obviously,
and it will be the basis to end the conflict, George. Right. Yep. Mark my words, we're going to go full circle and seeing what has all happened in between time should have never happened here. Gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We have to go to a hard break. And after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. All right, let's go back to Dima here in Moscow. Dima, let's kind of broaden it a little bit here. One of the biggest changes we've seen in the last 12 months is the complete capture of Europe by the Americans with the alleged, according to Seymour Hersh, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. And then we've also seen, and very important, and I don't think it has given enough traction in Western capitals and Western media, is the reaction of the global South. They're not on board for this Western assault, collective Western assault on Russia. They're not on board. They're not interested in it. As a matter of fact, just the opposite. Russia's appealing to them, reaching out to them, and trade is increasing. Huge changes in trading patterns right now, and that's only going to continue, even if the conflict were to end today. So the capture of Europe and the reaction of the global South. Dima.
Well, just some figures. The exports of Russian oil to India jumped 400% last year. The exports
basically from zero. Everybody, exactly. Basically from zero. Go ahead, yeah.
Well, now it's a substantial amount that Russia sells to India. The same story with China. So this conflict, it has changed the economics of the world. You're absolutely right. But I think the capture of Europe by the United States, it happened not so much economically as ideologically, basically. Just on the eve of this Munich conference, its former chairman, Wolfgang Ischinger, the German diplomat, he said in an interview to Der Spiegel magazine the following: we only needed Minsk Accord to stop Russian troops. I don't view it negatively. And the main mistake that we made during the 90s and the early 2000s, we underestimated Russia's imperial ambitions. So basically, this man, I mean, he was responsible, Ischinger was responsible, mark my words, according to the Minsk agreements, he was responsible for the dialogue between Kiev and the rebel republics. He did a wonderful job. Not a single meeting, not a single phone call took place. And now this man has been heading the Munich Security Conference, and now he's giving advice. And Merkel is in her honorary retreat. You know, she admitted that she actually was lying in 2015. They didn't want a real peace. They wanted to get Poroshenko out of fire because his troops suffered a defeat, basically defeat in the Donbass. So the problem with Europe is that it is losing economically. I mean, Russia and Ukraine are making human sacrifices. Europe is the big loser economically. And this is not me saying that, this is Emmanuel Todd, you know, the French philosopher who gave a very courageous interview to Le Figaro. And also Todd said that there were two major surprises during this conflict. First, almost everyone expected Russian army to defeat the Ukrainian army quickly, underestimating the amount of American investment and British investment in the Ukrainian armed forces, how much they had already rearmed Ukraine before 2022. And the second surprise was the fact that Russian economy sustained the blow. Sanctions did not destroy Russia, were not starting. That was the second major surprise. And the big loser is Europe, because the prices jumped. I mean, the European industry is becoming irrelevant because they pay so much for the production of their products. So basically, it's a huge increase. There's a huge increase in American egotism. I mean, look, after the World War II, the United States were ready to limit their ambitions to preserve Western Europe from Stalin and to preserve South Korea from North Korea, from a devastating artillery strike. Now the United States is basically telling Europe, we don't care. Buy our expensive gas, stay without Russian gas, destroy your economy, you know, make a black hole out of Russia. We don't care. The same story with the Far East, you know, fight China. We don't care about your economy. Japan must fight China. South Korea must fight China.
But you know, but George, how do you explain that? I mean, it is ideological. And again, you and I talk on a regular basis about elite capture here, because you know, I can't understand the logic, at least in a formal sense, is that it's all about Ukraine's sovereignty when Europe over the last year has erased its own economic sovereignty almost completely, George.
Yes, it's very interesting. It is, as Dima said, a complete ideological capture, because there was once, and not that long ago, a distinctively European outlook on international affairs. I mean, on a variety of issues, but in most particular in relation to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the Europeans differed from the United States. Yes, they were members of NATO, but they said it doesn't make sense to us, and it's not in our national interest to pursue an aggressive, hostile policy toward the Soviet Union. We had, you know, Germany said it doesn't, you know, it damages our relations with the East. And then France again, you know, we need a specific European foreign policy. All that is gone, and it's a completely. I mean, it's just Dima quoting Ischinger saying, "Russian imperial ambition." What imperial ambition? It's like, there's nothing. I mean, George Soros was talking about the other day, also at the Munich Security Conference. Oh, we must destroy the Russian Empire. What empire? What is he talking about? But now this is, again, they get this from the United States. Oh, Russia has an empire. There is no Russian empire. We know exactly the origins of this war. The origins of this war was NATO expansion, and particularly the attempt to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. And Russia said that this is, you know, that this affects our security adversely. We have to address this issue. But instead, we're wallowing in this absolute nonsense. And then you think, well, where is the European outlook? Where's the European feeling that, hey, this is our partner. We share a continent with them. It makes sense for us to have good trading, economic relations with someone who shares our continent.
And as we speak right now, there's been a muted reaction by the German government to the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, which was very important for its economy. And you just have to look who benefits, then you know who did it. And I strongly urge everyone to go to Substack and read Cy Hirsch's article, which apparently is just a taster. A lot more apparently is going to come. Dima, you're Mr. Ideology on Crosstalk, and we're always happy when you're here. But I think you're absolutely right, because of going back to the global South, it is kind of received in an ideological way, and they're rejecting it from the West. They're not interested in the West postmodernism. They're not interested in their quote unquote values. As a matter of fact, if we look at the history of the Cold War, a lot of former colonies of the West, they actually were attracted to Russia because they saw Russia as an anti-imperialist force. They weren't particularly interested in the Soviet Union's communism, but that really didn't matter. Now it actually is a hand in the glove. Russia is a conservative country. Most of these countries, these post-colonial countries, are very conservative as well. And it's a very, very good relationship. And they still see the West as a colonial attempting to maintain its colonial mastery over the rest of the world. So, I mean, this is one of the biggest changes we've had in the last year, is that we used to talk about realignment. Well, it's actually happening in real time. Dima.
In Russia, part of the narrative right now, if you listen to the people like Zakhar Prilepin and others, they say that maybe it's our disadvantage that we are white and we are Europeans. The West treats us with such hostility that if we were black or if we looked Oriental, that would make things a lot easier to understand, But I can say...
But Dima, you're right, but it's the other way around. It's because you're white, you should act like us, but you won't do it. And that's what infuriates them, okay?
Maybe.
It infuriates them.
I can only say, talking about this Munich conference, when I heard the Lithuanians say very, very hostile things about Russia, I remember how Lithuania became independent in 1991, how Estonia became independent without one shot fired. And I remember the sentiment in society. We were all very happy for them. I mean, Yeltsin was the first foreign leader to recognize the independence of the Baltic countries. The idea was, let bygones be bygones. We all suffered under Stalin now. We want to see your success. But of course, we didn't want to have them as enemies. And basically, when NATO says, oh, Russia breached the deal, Russia attacked Ukraine. No, you breached the deal, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, the deal was that these countries would not be hostile. They would not be, okay, maybe they would not be great friends, but they would not be hostile. Ukraine was extremely hostile, especially in the last 8 years. And countries of the global South, when they look at it, when they see how Russian property, private property, is being seized in the West, how Russia is mistreated as a state, how Russian athletes are subjected to such discrimination that even Hitler did not do it to black athletes during the Olympics in Germany.
Well, I mean, I think the lesson is learned is that, the West wants to have control of all telecommunications, all financing and banking and all that. And then that the countries that go along with it, like Russia did after the end of the Cold War, you can suddenly become a really big victim of it. And I think that's a lot of countries see that. If you use your system against the Russians, you can use it against us. George, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that just following up on Dima, it was precisely that which was promised to the Soviet Union, to Gorbachev in 1990-91. Hey, you don't have to worry about anything, because when once we kind of embrace them, and particularly when we have the united Germany within NATO, you won't have any problems because they will be under NATO's control, and so they won't be hostile to you. So, in fact, everything that has happened in recent years kind of confirms, Stalin's darkest thoughts. Hey, the moment they get independence, they're going to join an alliance against us. They're going to be waging a war against us. I mean, that's kind of what he was saying in his wartime conferences, and what NATO has done has confirmed his darkest forebodings.
And if in the long term here, who was the one that made that great mistake? It was Gorbachev. No other Soviet leader would even contemplate doing something like that, and he believed him. And that is the original sin of all of this, is believing these people that they had benign intentions, okay? I mean, I'm not worried about the Germans. I'm worried about NATO, and that was the whole point, okay? Yeah, exactly. All right, gentlemen, we had too big of a topic to discuss here, but we did get to the outer layers here. I want to thank my guests in Moscow and in Budapest.